When you look at U.S.-Russia relations in the years since the invasion of Ukraine, what you see is not the old Cold War in black and white. It's a gray, volatile confrontation shaped by exhaustion, sanctions, and shifting ambitions on both sides. Moscow's war has dragged on far longer than Vladimir Putin ever expected. He entered Ukraine in 2022 believing he could decapitate Kiev's government in days, divide NATO, and intimidate the West back into passivity. Instead, he got a long grind, a war that bled his forces and his treasury, and a Western coalition that, however imperfect, held together longer than anyone thought it would. But here we are in late 2025, and it's clear Russia hasn't been defeated, and America hasn't finished the job of containment. I'll tell you this, Putin's objectives have evolved. He no longer sells Russians the dream of quick victory. He sells them defiance resistance against a decadent West that, in his propaganda, wants to erase Russia's sovereignty and faith. That's not just spin, it's strategy. When he says this is no Cold War, it's a fiery conflict, he's warning that his regime's survival depends on keeping this confrontation alive. The more the West sees Russia as permanently dangerous, the more Putin cements control at home. And on the ground, Russia has adapted. Their economy, contrary to early predictions, hasn't collapsed. Sanctions hurt, yes, but they built trade detours through China, Turkey, and the Persian Gulf. They've tightened control of capital outflows, kept energy sales going to Asia, and invested heavily in domestic arms production. Their GDP growth last quarter, modest as it was, tells a story. Isolation hasn't crippled the regime, it's hardened it. Meanwhile, their military has learned through attrition. Gone are the early blunders of 2022 and 2023, the logistical chaos, the conscripts with empty rifles. Now they're using drones at scale, learning from Iranian tactics, and targeting Ukrainian energy grids with ruthless precision. It's not sophisticated warfare, but it's persistent, and persistence counts in a war of exhaustion. Here's the reality. The Kremlin's goal isn't necessarily to win Ukraine outright anymore, it's to wait out the West. To make Washington, London, and Warsaw argue over the next aid package to let fatigue and politics fracture resolve. In other words, Putin's clock runs longer than ours. He knows the West lives on election cycles. He governs on survival instincts. And that's where the United States stands at a crossroads. We face a Russia that's no longer capable of blitzkrieg, but entirely capable of destabilization, cyber attacks, gas manipulation, mercenary networks, disinformation campaigns. We face a Kremlin betting that America will turn inward, that we'll see Ukraine as someone else's problem. If that happens, we'll relive history. The moment we step back, aggression steps forward. So, as I see it, this is the starting point for any honest conversation about U.S.-Russia relations after Ukraine. We're not dealing with a fading empire, we're dealing with a wounded predator, still dangerous, still cunning. The question isn't whether we can make peace with Putin's Russia, it's whether we can secure the peace that follows him. Because make no mistake, his end will come. The real challenge is whether America has the strategic patience and moral clarity to prepare for that day instead of improvising when it arrives. Let's talk about sanctions, the favorite instrument of modern American foreign policy and one of our most misunderstood. After the invasion of Ukraine, Washington moved fast. We froze Russian reserves, cut major banks off from SWIFT, sanctioned oligarchs, and hit the energy sector. It was the largest sanctions campaign in modern history, and at the time, it looked like the economic equivalent of a precision strike. But 3 years in, we have to ask the uncomfortable question, have sanctions actually changed the Kremlin's behavior or just hardened its resolve? Here's what I see. In the short term, sanctions worked. They shocked the ruble, cratered foreign investment, and sent inflation through the roof in Russia. But over time, that shock wore off. The Russian economy didn't collapse, it adapted. They built a sanctions-resistant ecosystem by leaning on China for tech components, on India for oil trade, on Turkey and the UAE for financial routes. They even used crypto rails and shadow shipping to keep the oil flowing. The irony is that while sanctions froze yachts in Monaco, they didn't stop Moscow from building drones in Kazan. That's not to say sanctions failed. They're a tool, not a magic spell. What sanctions have done is degrade Russia's long-term growth and limit its access to high-tech inputs like semiconductors. You can't fight a modern war without chips, bearings, and optics, and Russia is scavenging all of them. Their defense industry now runs on imports from China and smuggled Western parts at higher cost and lower efficiency. That's pain, real structural pain, but it's not collapse. So the question becomes, what's the goal? Is it to hurt Russia or to change Russia? Too often, Washington treats sanctions as moral theater, a way to say, we're doing something. But sanctions only work when they're part of a coherent strategy, one that links pressure with diplomacy, punishment with off-ramps. You can't just freeze assets and hope for regime change. That's not strategy. That's wishful thinking. Now, there's new debate in Congress, the so-called Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025. It would tighten secondary sanctions on countries that help Moscow skirt restrictions, particularly Chinese banks and Middle Eastern intermediaries. On paper, that's the right instinct. Close the back doors. But here's the challenge. When you expand sanctions too far, you risk alienating the very partners you need to hold the coalition together. Europe is already showing fatigue. Businesses in France, Germany, and Italy want to re-engage with Russian markets. Even in Washington, you hear some voices saying it's time to rethink the pressure campaign. Let's be honest, those voices are wrong. The last thing you do when a dictator digs in is blink first. But we also have to be smart. The sanctions of 2022 were a hammer. Now we need a scalpel. That means using targeted sanctions that go after the real arteries of Putin's power, his defense industry, his intelligence networks, his cash laundromats, while working with allies to ensure we're not cutting ourselves off from energy stability in the process. One more point, and I think it matters deeply. Sanctions are only credible when the world believes the United States will enforce them consistently. Under this administration, enforcement has been sporadic. Some companies face massive penalties. Others get quiet waivers. If sanctions are to mean anything, they have to be predictable. Putin doesn't respect sentiment. He respects power, and power is consistency over time. So yes, sanctions matter, but they're not enough. They buy us leverage. They don't buy us peace. And leverage only works when it's used wisely, not endlessly. The challenge ahead isn't just tightening the screws, it's defining what outcome those screws are meant to produce. Because if we can't articulate the end game, we risk turning economic warfare into an endless habit rather than a pathway to real victory. Diplomacy with Russia, at this point, is less about friendship and more about friction management, knowing when to talk, when to walk, and when to hold firm. We've seen two major summits this year, one in Riyadh back in February and another up in Alaska this August. Both were billed as attempts to lower tensions and open channels, but let's be candid, neither produced a breakthrough. In truth, they reveal just how far apart Washington and Moscow really are, not just on Ukraine, but on the very idea of what global order means. At the Riyadh summit, the optics were carefully staged. Neutral ground, a Gulf intermediary, diplomats smiling for cameras. But the substance? Putin wanted sanctions, relief, and Western recognition of the territories he's occupied, effectively rewarding aggression. The U.S. delegation, for its part, wanted a commitment to withdraw, to allow international monitoring, and to stop targeting civilian infrastructure. Both sides spoke, neither side yielded. It wasn't negotiation, it was theater. But theater matters in diplomacy. It shows who's playing for time and who's playing for outcome. And in Riyadh, Russia was clearly playing for time. By the time the Alaska meeting rolled around in August, Moscow's tone had shifted colder, harder, and more performative. Russian envoys arrived not to compromise, but to warn. They accused Washington of fueling endless war by arming Ukraine and hinted that any future U.S. missile tests could provoke unpredictable responses. That's classic Kremlin signaling, pair threats with invitations to talk, hoping to confuse restraint with weakness. I sat at enough classified briefings to tell you when Russia starts offering dialogue, it's usually because they're buying breathing room to reload. Now, I'm not against diplomacy, far from it. But diplomacy without leverage is appeasement. We've learned that lesson before. The reason President Reagan succeeded with the Soviets wasn't charm, it was strength. He built the military, revived the economy, and projected confidence that America could outlast any tyrant. Then and only then did the Kremlin decide it was safer to talk than to fight. That's the posture we need again. Today, unfortunately, our diplomatic tone has become muddled. Washington says we'll stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, but simultaneously signals it wants to avoid escalation. To Putin, those words sound like hesitation, like there's a clock ticking on American resolve, and when an autocrat senses time on his side, he digs in deeper. Diplomacy in this phase must be guided by principle and precision. Principle meaning we never legitimize territorial theft. Precision meaning we talk only when it serves a concrete strategic purpose. Back-channel communications about prisoner exchanges or nuclear safety, fine. But summits that exist just to say we're talking do more harm than good. They create the illusion of progress where none exists and undermine the moral clarity of our stance. Here's what true leverage would look like. A U.S. position anchored in power, backed by an alliance that's cohesive, an economy that's resilient, and a military posture that signals we're not bluffing, then you talk. Then diplomacy works. You can't beg your way to peace with a regime that thrives on coercion. You deter it, contain it, and negotiate only from the high ground. And let me say this to those who believe dialogue alone can restore stability. Stability built on concession is an illusion. Every time the West has rewarded Russian aggression from Georgia in 2008 to Crimea in 2014, we've only invited the next invasion. Real peace requires resolve, and resolve is demonstrated not in words, but in the consequences that follow them. So as we think about the next phase of U.S.-Russia diplomacy, the rules should be simple. Talk when it strengthens our position, never when it weakens it. Because the world doesn't measure our intentions, it measures our spine. And right now, America's ability to stand tall without blinking will define whether this century belongs to freedom or to fear. Ukraine remains the hinge on which this entire relationship turns. Everything about U.S.-Russia relations now runs through that battlefield. Every sanction, every diplomatic overture, every alliance debate. And make no mistake, the outcome in Ukraine will determine the credibility of American power for decades to come. If a sovereign democracy can be carved up by force in the 21st century and the United States simply adjusts to it, then every autocrat watching from Tehran to Beijing will draw the same conclusion: America blinks when the fight drags on. So where does Ukraine stand today? Despite the headlines about stalemates, Kyiv has achieved remarkable resilience. They've survived waves of missile barrages, adapted their drone warfare faster than anyone thought possible, and even struck deep into Russian territory, energy depots, rail lines, logistical hubs. Every one of those strikes sends a message: Russia's heartland isn't untouchable anymore. And while Western analysts argue over whether Ukraine can win, Ukrainians aren't talking about winning or losing. They're talking about surviving with dignity, which in many ways is the purest form of victory. But here's the challenge. America's support, once automatic, has become conditional on polls, budgets, and election seasons. We debate whether to send long-range missiles as if freedom comes with a spending cap. There's been intense discussion about authorizing Tomahawk or ATACMS systems for Kyiv, systems that could strike deeper into Russian supply lines. Moscow predictably warns of uncontrolled escalation. That phrase, uncontrolled escalation, is a favorite in the Kremlin playbook. They know it triggers anxiety in Western capitals. It's the same language they used when we debated giving Ukraine HIMARS or when we debated tanks. And every time, the world discovered the same truth. Deterrence doesn't come from hesitation. It comes from capability. We have to be clear about something. Supporting Ukraine isn't charity. It's self-defense by proxy. Every dollar we spend, every shell we send, prevents the need for a far costlier conflict, later one that could involve American troops if NATO's borders are ever breached. Putin tests boundaries. If he finds weakness in Ukraine, he won't stop there. Moldova, the Baltics, even cyber operations targeting U.S. infrastructure, they all become fair game in his mind. Now, I understand the fatigue. After 3 years of headlines, after watching billions flow overseas, many Americans wonder, when does this end? It's a fair question. But the answer depends on what we mean by end. If by end we mean no more fighting, then yes, that could come tomorrow if Ukraine surrenders. But if by end we mean a just peace, then it comes only when Russia stops believing that aggression pays. That's why America's role matters, because our consistency or lack of it determines the incentives for every future war. Still, supporting Ukraine doesn't mean writing blank checks. It means demanding strategy. Aid should be tied to outcomes, strengthening air defense, securing logistics, rooting out corruption, ensuring transparency. The Ukrainian people deserve accountability as much as they deserve support. We can be both generous and prudent. That's how great nations act. One of the biggest mistakes in foreign policy is assuming moral clarity eliminates the need for discipline. It doesn't. We can love Ukraine's courage and still expect efficient use of U.S. aid. We can stand for freedom and still guard our taxpayers. But what we must never do is confuse fatigue with principle. The moment we let exhaustion dictate policy, we hand victory to the aggressor. You and I both know that wars are ultimately moral contests. They test not just armies, but values, endurance, truth, and conviction. Ukraine's fight reminds us of who we are, or at least who we once were, a nation willing to defend liberty, not just in our borders, but in the idea of human freedom itself. And that's why the stakes go far beyond Kyiv or Donetsk. They reach into our own soul as a country. Because if we can't stand firm when a democracy bleeds for its survival, what moral ground will we stand on when the next storm comes closer to home? When I travel through Europe, talk with diplomats, or meet NATO officials, one message keeps surfacing: unity is holding, but just barely. The alliance that rallied in 2022 was extraordinary. Countries that had spent decades debating defense budgets suddenly discovered urgency. Germany reversed years of policy to supply arms. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, a tectonic shift that expanded the alliance's northern flank by over 800 miles. That kind of transformation doesn't happen without a wake-up call. And Putin, ironically, gave NATO exactly that. But now, as we approach the fourth year of this war, cracks are starting to show. Some allies, Poland, the Baltics, the UK, still treat Ukraine's defense as existential. Others, Italy, Hungary, parts of France, whisper about de-escalation, negotiated settlements, and realistic outcomes. In translation, that means they're getting tired. Energy prices have stabilized somewhat, but inflation and migration pressures are wearing down public patience. European politics are tilting inward, and every populist surge brings with it the temptation to retreat from global responsibility. The problem is, Russia sees all of this. The Kremlin reads every headline, every parliamentary vote, every protest about war fatigue. They know exactly where Europe's seams are, and they exploit them through propaganda, cyber attacks, energy, leverage, and disinformation. It's not just tanks that threaten NATO. Its division. Putin has always believed the West's weakness is psychological, not military. If he can split Europe from America, or even fracture European unity itself, he wins without firing another shot. That's why U.S. leadership matters so much. America doesn't just hold the biggest stick, we hold the glue. NATO without firm U.S. engagement becomes a committee of good intentions. NATO with firm U.S. engagement becomes the single most formidable defensive alliance in human history. And when Washington hesitates, everyone else follows. You can see it in recent debates. The question isn't whether Europe can defend itself, it's whether it will, and that depends always on whether America will lead. Now, there's been talk about burden sharing. That's fair. European allies need to spend more. The 2% GDP target should be the floor, not the ceiling. But leadership isn't just about who pays the bill, it's about who sets the tone. And tone matters. When American officials hedge their language, when they talk about avoiding escalation more than defending freedom, it ripples across the alliance. Words from Washington become excuses in Berlin and Paris. Resolve is contagious, so is hesitation. Some NATO officials are now floating bolder measures, limited enforcement of Ukrainian airspace, fast-tracking new defense corridors through Poland and Romania, and more permanent stationing of troops in Eastern Europe. Those steps would send a clear message. NATO isn't a debating club, it's a shield. But that shield only works if it's backed by conviction. The credibility of Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, is like a muscle. If you don't flex it, it atrophies. And we have to talk about credibility at home. The world watches our domestic politics, the budget fights, the isolationist slogans, the short-term thinking. When Congress stalls a security package for Ukraine or debates withdrawing from NATO, Moscow celebrates. It feeds the Kremlin's narrative that America is too divided to sustain long-term commitments. That perception alone emboldens aggression, You and I both know America doesn't win by retreating. We win by leading. And leadership isn't arrogance, it's stewardship. It means keeping our word, honoring alliances, and standing tall even when it's hard. Because if NATO falters now, if the West signals fatigue, then what started in Ukraine won't stay in Ukraine. Putin's lesson to the world would be simple: endurance beats principle. That's not the lesson I want history to write about this generation. I want it to say we stood firm, that we kept faith with our allies, and that we understood the price of freedom is never paid just once. The question isn't whether America can lead, it's whether we still believe in why we should. Every time Russia faces setbacks on the battlefield, it reaches for the same bag of tricks, threats, deception, and hybrid warfare. When tanks can't deliver victory, the Kremlin turns to fear. And for the past year, that fear has come in many forms: nuclear hints, cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage, and the gray zone tactics that live between peace and war. If we're going to understand how to deal with Russia after Ukraine, we need to understand this new kind of conflict because it's already here. Let's start with the nuclear card. Moscow's diplomats have spent months warning that any new U.S. missile test or NATO provocation could trigger a devastating response. We've seen this movie before. It's the same rhetoric the Soviets used in the early 1000s. 980 seconds, intimidate, posture, and hope the West loses its nerve. But here's what's changed. Russia today relies on nuclear bluster more than ever because its conventional power has been exposed as hollow. Putin knows that battlefield failure undermines his aura of invincibility, so he compensates with threats he hopes we'll take too seriously. Now, to be clear, nuclear threats should never be dismissed, but they must never be rewarded either. When an aggressor learns that brandishing nukes earns concessions, you've just given him a permanent weapon of coercion. Reagan understood that. He negotiated arms control only from a position of overwhelming strength. We should do the same. Instead of freezing our own modernization programs or delaying missile defense deployments, we should accelerate them. Deterrence works because adversaries believe in it. It collapses the moment they doubt it. But nuclear rhetoric is just the loudest tool. Russia's quieter weapons are often more effective. Cyber attacks against Western infrastructure, energy grids, hospitals, financial systems have spiked in recent months. These aren't random hacks, they're probes. The Kremlin wants to know how far it can push without triggering a kinetic response. The same goes for disinformation campaigns. You've seen them online, fabricated stories about Western biolabs, NATO provocations, Ukrainian corruption. Their goal isn't persuasion, it's paralysis. Flood the conversation with so much noise that truth itself becomes suspect. And when a democracy loses confidence in its own information ecosystem, it loses part of its armor. Then there's the covert side sabotage and assassinations across Europe. Railway fires in Germany, unexplained explosions in Baltic ports, mysterious deaths of Russian dissidents abroad. These are all signatures of what Moscow calls active measures, operations meant to intimidate and remind the world that Russian reach knows no borders. It's the same KGB mindset in a digital age, deniable, cynical, and relentless. What does that mean for U.S. strategy? It means we can't think of conflict with Russia as something confined to geography. The front line isn't just Donbass. It's the digital networks that connect our societies, the pipelines that fuel our economies, the elections that define our legitimacy. Deterrence in the 21st century isn't only about tanks and treaties, it's about resilience. Are our institutions prepared to withstand information war? Are our companies hardened against cyber threats? Are our citizens informed enough to spot manipulation when they see it? Let's be honest, we've been slow to adapt. Russia spends a fraction of what we do on defense, but every dollar they spend on disruption yields disproportionate impact. A well-placed cyber attack can cost billions. A coordinated disinformation wave can shape an election. And unlike missiles, those weapons leave no smoking crater, only confusion and distrust. That's how authoritarian regimes win battles in the modern era, not by conquering territory, but by corroding truth. So yes, we have to keep arming Ukraine, but we also have to armor ourselves against the next generation of Russian aggression that won't arrive on tanks. But through screens, servers, and whispers, America must make it clear that gray zone warfare is still warfare and that it will be met with real consequences, not press releases. Because the moment we start treating hybrid attacks as background noise, we'll discover too late that the noise has become the signal. If you really want to understand the long-term stakes of U.S.-Russia relations, you can't stop at the battlefield of the diplomacy, you have to follow the money. Because behind every missile, every propaganda outlet, every act of aggression, there's a financial network keeping it alive. The war in Ukraine has become as much an economic confrontation as a military one, and we're now seeing the outlines of a new global order shaped by how nations choose to deal or not deal with Russia. Let's start with the basics. Sanctions pushed Russia out of Western capital markets, but they didn't push it out of global trade. Instead, Moscow built parallel routes, what you might call an alternative economy for autocrats. Oil that once went to Europe now flows east, discounted to China and India. Energy that used to cross the Baltic now moves through the Caspian or via dark fleets tankers with their GPS systems turned off, sanctioned but still sailing. Financial transfers happen through mirror banks in Dubai or Shanghai, often using non-SWIFT messaging systems that Russia and China are promoting as sovereign alternatives. What does that mean in practice? It means sanctions have slowed the machine, but they haven't stopped it. Russia's economy is smaller, yes, but it's also leaner and more militarized. Civilian industries are being converted to defense production. Factories that once built tractors now produce artillery shells. The Kremlin is trying to build a wartime economy for the long haul, betting that the West's attention span will collapse before their will does. At the same time, the global energy picture is shifting in ways that weaken the leverage we used to have. For decades, American sanctions worked because the dollar was the oxygen of the world economy. Cut off that oxygen, and regime suffocated. But now, countries like China, India, and Saudi Arabia are experimenting with non-dollar trades, yuan settlements, rupee-ruble swaps, oil sales priced in local currencies. It's not replacing the dollar yet, but it's eroding its dominance around the edges. That erosion matters because it limits our ability to impose pressure without global buy-in. If enough nations can work around our sanctions, the financial stick we've relied on loses its weight. And there's another consequence, inflation and energy shocks at home. Every time sanctions tighten, global supply chains react. Oil markets spike, fertilizer costs rise, and American consumers feel the squeeze. I've heard it from families in Texas, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, people asking why their grocery bills are higher because of a war thousands of miles away. It's a fair question, and it's one that our leaders need to answer honestly. The cost of confronting aggression today is real, but the cost of letting it grow unchecked is far greater. If Russia can rewrite borders by force and still sell its oil freely, then every authoritarian regime will take note. We'll wake up to a world where coercion replaces commerce, and that's a world where Americans pay much more than higher gas prices. Still, there's no denying sanctions fatigue is real. Some allies are quietly reopening trade channels, framing it as humanitarian or technical exceptions. Others look the other way at companies routing goods through intermediaries. It's not betrayal. It's drift, the slow unraveling of unity that sanctions were supposed to reinforce. That's why Washington must be strategic. Instead of flooding the system with endless new restrictions, we should focus on enforcement and coordination. Make every sanction count. Make every violation hurt. Sanctions only work when the target feels isolated and believes the coalition will hold. You and I both know the truth. Financial power is perishable. It depends on trust, the trust that America's system will remain stable, that our word means something, that our alliances aren't temporary. The minute our partners doubt that, they start hedging. And the minute they start hedging, the deterrent value of the dollar begins to fade. So as we look at the next phase of this economic confrontation, our task is twofold. First, keep Russia contained financially. No loopholes, no indulgence for enablers. Second, keep America's economic leadership credible, sound fiscal policy, predictable rule of law, strong alliances, because power built on sanctions alone is brittle. Power built on trust and consistency endures. The Cold War wasn't won by embargoes alone. It was won because the world believed the American system worked better. If we want to win this century's version, we have to prove that again, not just with penalties, but with performance. There's a phrase we used to hear in the Reagan years, peace through strength. It wasn't a slogan, It was a doctrine, a recognition that real peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of credible deterrence. And as I look at our Russia policy today, that principle is what's missing. We've drifted from clarity to caution, from conviction to calibration. Every move is weighed not just by what it achieves, but by how it might be perceived. That mindset might win you applause in academic circles, but it loses you wars of endurance. Let's be clear about something. We cannot negotiate our way out of aggression that has not yet been defeated. Russia has shown again and again that it interprets compromise as weakness. From Georgia to Crimea to Donbass, every Western overture that was meant to de-escalate became an invitation for the next invasion. That's not because diplomacy is bad. It's because diplomacy without leverage is just performance art. When a regime wages war on its neighbors, kills civilians, and weaponizes energy, it doesn't need another roundtable. It needs to face consequences that outlast any press release. Now, I'm not saying we should never talk. We should maintain channels to avoid misunderstandings, to manage nuclear risk, to secure prisoner exchanges, but those talks must happen from a posture of strength. The message must be unambiguous. The United States will not ease pressure until aggression ends and accountability begins. The worst outcome would be to drift into a frozen conflict, a stalemate that lets Russia keep its conquests while the world pretends it's peace. That's not stability. That's surrender with a different name. You and I both know what happens when America sends mixed signals. Autocrats test boundaries. Allies lose faith. Think back to the late 1,970 seconds when we looked uncertain. The Soviets expanded. When we rebuilt confidence in the 1,980 seconds, they folded. The same pattern holds today. Deterrence isn't about shouting louder. It's about making your adversary believe that crossing a red line will bring unbearable cost. And for that to happen, red lines must exist and they must be enforced. So what should those red lines be today? First, we can never allow Ukraine's defeat or dismemberment to be normalized. A forced peace that rewards territorial theft would destroy the very principle of sovereignty the post-war world was built on. Second, NATO's borders must be sacred. Any Russian attack, hybrid or direct, on a member state must trigger an immediate and unified response. Third, nuclear blackmail cannot be rewarded. If Russia even hints at using tactical nuclear weapons, our answer must be swift, coordinated, and overwhelming, economic, diplomatic, and, if necessary, strategic. But deterrence alone isn't enough. It has to be matched by strategic patience. This war will not end in one election cycle, and our commitment cannot depend on who sits in the Oval Office. Putin is counting on American politics to do what his army couldn't: fracture the coalition and drain the will. We have to prove him wrong by showing that America's word transcends administration, that our alliances aren't transactional, that freedom is not a partisan value. And that brings me to the moral dimension of strategy. We can talk about sanctions, weapons, and summits all day, but at the core of this confrontation lies a moral test. Do we still believe that liberty is worth defending even when the fight is hard, even when the cost is high? Strength isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It means drawing the line and standing on it. So as we think about what comes next, here's the principle I hold. Negotiate when it strengthens peace, not when it rewards aggression. Press when pressure works, hold when patience matters, and never confuse restraint with virtue. Because the world doesn't measure us by how often we talk about peace. It measures us by whether our strength makes peace possible. If you want to know where the next front lies, look not to the maps of today, but to the pressure points of tomorrow, the places where Russia can hurt without triggering a formal war, where ambiguity is its armor. Putin's strategy has always been expansion through confusion. Advance just enough to test the line, then deny, distract, and dare the world to respond. That's why, even as the guns roar in Ukraine, the Kremlin is quietly preparing new theaters, some physical, some digital, some political. First, let's talk geography. Russia's military has shifted its focus east of the Dnipro, fortifying the Donbass and building defensive belts that stretch hundreds of miles. The goal isn't breakthrough, it's entrenchment. By holding territory, even if ruined, Putin claims victory at home and leverage abroad. But the real risk isn't in Donetsk or Luhansk, it's in the shadows beyond Ukraine's borders. Intelligence reports show renewed Russian activity in Transnistria, that sliver of Moldovan land long used as a forward base for smuggling and sabotage. The same pattern appears in Belarus, where Russian forces rotate under the guise of training missions. None of this is coincidence, it's preparation. Then there's energy. Every modern empire runs on it, and Russia has long wielded it as both weapon and lifeline. Over the past year, we've seen targeted drone strikes against European gas facilities, mysterious accidents on undersea cables, and cyber intrusions at power plants. Those aren't random. They're part of a deliberate campaign to remind Europe that its infrastructure is never beyond reach. Putin's message is clear: you may have replaced my oil, but I can still turn out your lights. And the scary part is he's not wrong. The next front also runs through the digital world. Russian state hackers and private proxies like the Sandworm Group are escalating operations against Western networks. Their targets aren't just government servers, they're financial systems, hospitals, transportation hubs. The aim isn't to destroy, but to disrupt, to sow uncertainty and expose how fragile our daily lives have become in the digital age. Imagine for a moment if an entire banking network in a NATO country went offline for 48 hours. No soldiers cross borders, no missiles fly, but confidence craters. That's modern warfare, Russian style. And let's not overlook the political front. The Kremlin's information apparatus is already gearing up for elections across the West. They amplify polarization, infiltrate social media, and fuel narratives designed to pit citizens against each other. In Europe, it's Ukraine fatigue and energy realism. In the U.S., it's why should we care? The methods vary, but the objective is constant. Fracture unity before it ever faces a test. If the West turns inward, Russia wins outward. So how does America prepare for these next fronts? Not by panic, but by planning. First, we strengthen deterrence on NATO's perimeter. That means more permanent troop presence in Poland and the Baltics, more integrated missile defense across Europe, and real-time intelligence sharing. That leaves Moscow guessing what we know. Second, we harden critical infrastructure, physical and digital. Every substation, port, and data center in the free world is part of this fight, whether it knows it or not. And third, we coordinate sanctions enforcement and cyber defense as two halves of the same coin. You can't starve a regime's war chest if you let its hackers keep stealing through the back door. But perhaps most importantly, we have to prepare psychologically. The next Russian offensive may not come with tanks and parades. It'll come through outages, headlines, and half-truths. It'll be fought in the murk between war and peace, designed to exhaust rather than conquer. That's why clarity is our strongest weapon. Clarity about what we stand for, what we'll defend, and what we'll never tolerate. You and I both know history doesn't repeat itself, but it does whisper. And what it's whispering now is that the next front will test not our firepower, but our focus. The nation that keeps its moral compass steady when the fog of confusion rolls in, that's the one that prevails. America's task is not only to outgun Russia, but to outlast its cynicism. Because tyranny, at its core, feeds on fatigue, and our greatest act of defiance is endurance. At the end of the day, this confrontation with Russia isn't just about borders on a map or sanctions on a ledger. It's about the kind of world our children will inherit. Every great test of American foreign policy, from the Cold War to the fight against terrorism, has forced us to answer one question: what does America stand for when standing firm costs something? That question is before us again. And the answer will define not just Ukraine's fate, but our own credibility as a nation that leads by principle rather than convenience. The war in Ukraine shattered the illusion that the 21st century would be an era of peace by default. It reminded us brutally that evil doesn't retire, it adapts. Russia's invasion was not only an assault on a neighbor, it was a direct challenge to the entire framework of post-World War II order, the idea that sovereignty and law are stronger than tanks and fear. If that idea collapses, everything America built after 1945 NATO, the UN, the global economy starts to wobble. And it doesn't take much imagination to see what fills the vacuum. A world ruled by coercion, where truth is optional, and where might once again makes right. So where does that leave U.S.-Russia relations after Ukraine? The honest answer is in a cold, uneasy limbo, one that will likely last years. But within that uncertainty lies opportunity. The same way Reagan turned confrontation into leverage, we can use pressure today to shape the peace of tomorrow. That requires discipline, keeping sanctions tight but strategic, diplomacy open but conditional, and alliances unified but adaptable. It means we don't chase illusions of resets or mutual understanding. We build stability the hard way by demonstrating that aggression carries lasting cost. Let's be frank, Russia under Putin will not become a partner. It will remain a rival, perhaps an enemy, until it either changes leadership or changes its worldview. That's the reality we must plan for. But the goal isn't endless hostility, it's containment that protects peace. The same logic that guided Truman and Eisenhower still applies. Prevent expansion, preserve alliances, and promote the idea that freedom is stronger than fear. There's also a moral component to all of this, one that too many policymakers treat as sentimental. But morality in foreign policy isn't weakness, it's ballast. It keeps us from drifting into cynicism. When we stand with a free nation under siege, we're not just defending someone else's borders. We're defending the idea that liberty still matters in a cynical age. Every Ukrainian who refuses to yield under bombardment is a reminder of what courage looks like when freedom is more than a slogan. America's challenge now is to balance idealism with endurance. We can't afford utopian naivety, but neither can we surrender to fatalism. The world is watching whether this country still has the moral stamina to lead. Because if we falter here, if we let fatigue, politics, or fear define our foreign policy, we don't just lose influence abroad, we lose coherence at home. Leadership is a habit, and when a nation forgets how to exercise it, it forgets itself. So here's what I believe. The path forward isn't glamorous, it's slow, patient, often thankless, but it's necessary. We need to keep faith with our allies, invest in deterrence, confront aggression, and defend truth not just on the battlefield, but in our own civic life. That's how we win, not through rage or revenge, but through endurance and resolve. Someday, maybe years from now, Russia will face a reckoning not because we destroyed it, but because the truth finally outlasted its lies. And when that day comes, America must be ready, not surprised, not divided, but steady, because in the long arc of history, tyrannies always fall. The question is whether free nations remain strong enough to shape what comes after. If we stay the course firm, focused, faithful to our principles, we won't just outlast Putin's Russia. We'll remind the world that freedom, though tested, still endures. And that's the victory that truly matters.